Since 2022, Putin has openly threatened to use nuclear weapons against the West, and he's not joking. There have been dozens of speeches, simulated attacks, warhead tests, shifts in military doctrine, and direct declarations suggesting that the next step could be the end of civilization as we know it. And yet, despite all of that, the red button remains untouched. Even with Ukraine launching attacks into Russian regions like Kursk, destroying radar systems deep inside Russian territory, and American missiles crossing Russian skies, the Kremlin responds with silence, vague threats, and nothing more. Which raises the question no one dares to answer. Why hasn't Putin pushed the button yet? What exactly is stopping the hand of the most dangerous man on the planet? The truth is more terrifying than it seems. Putin knows that once he crosses that line, there's no going back. Russia's nuclear doctrine was rewritten in 2024 precisely to authorize the use of such weapons in scenarios like this. As of today, Russia is legally allowed to launch nuclear strikes even against countries that don't possess nuclear weapons, so long as they're backed by powers like the United States. In other words, technically, he can, but politically and strategically, he knows he can't. Because if he does, Putin won't just trigger the greatest military retaliation of the modern era. He'll lose China, he'll lose his allies, and worse, he'll lose control inside the Kremlin itself. The war he believes he controls would spin completely out of his grasp. That's why so far what we've witnessed is a carefully staged bluff. And the most ironic part? The one stopping Putin from turning the world into ashes isn't NATO, it's China. In November 2024, Vladimir Putin signed one of the most controversial documents of the post-Cold War era, titled Basic Principles of the State Policy of the Russian Federation on Nuclear Deterrence. The new text completely overhauled the Kremlin's guidelines on the use of atomic weapons. Previously, Russia's nuclear doctrine allowed for the use of such weapons only in the event of an existential threat to the state or in retaliation for a direct nuclear attack. But the new version tore up those rules and authorized something far more dangerous. Now, Russia claims the right to use nuclear warheads even in response to conventional attacks, as long as they come from countries backed by nuclear powers. In practice, this turns Ukraine, armed and supported by the West, into a legally valid target under Russian doctrine. Analysts at the RAND Corporation called this change the legitimization of ambiguity, while UN observers warned that the new doctrine opens the door to dangerous interpretations, where almost any threat could serve as justification for a nuclear strike. But inside the Kremlin, the real goal was different: to send a message. It was a direct response to the setbacks Russia suffered on the battlefield, particularly during the Kursk offensive, which exposed serious operational weaknesses and led to Ukrainian strikes on sensitive nuclear defense assets, such as the radar stations in Armavir. And yet, even with the revised document in place, and despite being the most permissive nuclear doctrine in modern Russian history, the red button remains untouched. Because doctrine is just paper, and Putin knows it. Launching a nuclear warhead, even a tactical one, against a country that doesn't even possess nuclear weapons would not be seen as a show of strength, but as an admission of failure. A public acknowledgement that Russia's military, despite its history and budget, was unable to defeat Ukraine without resorting to nuclear terror. And in this game of perception, where every word moves tanks and every threat triggers sanctions, Putin cannot afford to look weak. He may have rewritten the rules, but he's still playing the game afraid that the wrong move could flip the entire board. The greatest barrier between Putin and the use of nuclear weapons isn't in Washington, isn't in NATO, and certainly isn't in Kiev, it's in Beijing. Since the beginning of the conflict, President Xi Jinping has made China's position increasingly clear. In 2023, during a visit to Moscow, he told Putin directly, "Do not use nuclear weapons." The message was loud enough to echo around the world, and it didn't stop there. In multilateral meetings, official statements, and most recently in a joint communiqué signed in May 2025 with the Russian government itself, China reaffirmed its stance. Nuclear wars must never be fought nor even considered. But why such concern? What does China stand to lose? The answer is simple: everything. Beijing's rise to global power has been built on predictability, sustained by trade, economic stability, and a constant flow of goods, technology, and foreign investment. A nuclear strike in Europe wouldn't just threaten global military equilibrium, it would shatter the very economic foundation of Chinese power. Harsher sanctions, the collapse of trade routes, capital flight on an international scale. That is the scenario Xi Jinping is desperate to avoid. That's why China carefully avoids direct involvement on the battlefield, even though it remains the primary supplier of parts, drones, and strategic components used by Russia. Beijing continues to supply Moscow with everything possible, just short of crossing the red line drawn by the West. Delivering lethal, ready-to-use weapons would be crossing that line. Allowing a nuclear strike, even a tactical one, would be detonating the bridge that still connects China to the world. Putin understands this, and he knows that China isn't just vital to keep his army running, it's essential to keep his entire economy afloat. Russia has lost access to Western banks, global markets, and key supply chains. Today, China is the artificial lung keeping Moscow alive. And that's why, between fiery speeches and empty threats, the only thing truly keeping Putin's finger off the red button is Beijing's calculated silence. While Putin faces economic, diplomatic, and military pressure from the West on the outside, inside Russia, he confronts something far more dangerous and far harder to contain: the growing perception of weakness. Since the beginning of the war, the Kremlin's propaganda machine has worked tirelessly to preserve the image of a firm, strategic, and unbeatable leader. A head of state projecting absolute control over every movement, every battle, every speech. But that image is beginning to crack. To many within Russia's top ranks, the use of a nuclear weapon wouldn't be a show of strength. It would be the ultimate admission of failure. Even with modern tanks, Iranian drones, hypersonic missiles, and support from allies like Belarus and North Korea, the Russian military has been unable to defeat a Ukraine that is exhausted, fragmented, and surviving only through external aid. And that perception comes at a cost. Behind the scenes of the Kremlin, the tension is rising. Generals, ministers, and advisors are increasingly divided. There is fear of mutiny, desertions, and fractures within the command structure. A rash decision, such as launching a tactical nuke, could light the fuse of internal instability that is already quietly spreading through the corridors of Russian power. Putin's authority rests on a fragile tripod: control of the narrative, the illusion of military stability, and economic support from abroad. If any of these pillars collapse, the entire structure falls. And it's not just military insiders who are watching. Even the few remaining allies, like India and Turkey, have sent clear signals that a nuclear escalation would not be tolerated. India's foreign minister made it clear in diplomatic terms: any such move would result in immediate severance of relations. Turkey, though maintaining pragmatic ties with Moscow, has also hinted it would not support any action that puts the Black Sea at risk. If Putin decides to press the button, he won't just lose China. He'll also lose the few remaining allies still standing by his side, and with them, he'll lose the fragile grip on leadership that's barely holding together inside Russia. Worse yet, he would expose to the world the weakness of a superpower that had to turn to nuclear terror just to avoid defeat. That's why the threat must stay alive. The tension must be maintained, fueled, recycled. The doctrine has changed. The rhetoric has escalated. The missiles are ready. But as long as the bluff still works, it remains Putin's most powerful weapon. China draws the lines, allies step back, and Russian generals watch in silence. With every new cycle of threats, Putin's credibility is tested, because the more often he repeats the same warning without consequences, the more he has to escalate just to be taken seriously. And if one day the world stops believing him, Putin might conclude that the only way to be heard is by acting. The countdown didn't start with a missile. It started with silence, and that silence still lingers, for now. If you want to understand the true forces behind the most dangerous decisions of our time, subscribe now to Global Defense Report, turn on notifications, and stay ahead of the next move in this global power game. Because even the smallest misstep could change the fate of the world.